Good morning, everyone. I thank everyone for attending our webinar lecture this morning. I appreciate everyone giving time for this very interesting webinar on US-China relations. So we have very distinguished speakers for today on the topic. And actually, we are currently streaming live on Facebook. So if you have friends or colleagues who are interested in this lecture, you can definitely share the link to them. But in any case, again, I welcome everyone to this very interesting lecture that we're going to have for today. So we have two speakers lined up for this morning's lecture. We have Dr. Ralph COSSA and Dr. Chu Fang. We will begin first with the lecture or the presentation prepared by Dr. Ralph COSSA. So I guess without further ado, we can formally begin our webinar lecture for today. Um, so let me introduce to you formally our first speaker. So again, we have Dr. Ralph COSSA. Professor Ralph COSSA is a President Emeritus and Worldwide Support for Development Handa Haruhisa Chair in Peace Studies at the Pacific Forum. And the Pacific Forum is a Honolulu-based nonpartisan foreign policy research institute, a very well-known research institute. Professor COSSA is also a senior editor of the Forum's electronic journal, Comparative Connections, and he is also co-author of its regional overview. Professor COSSA is the primary U.S. representative and former international co-chair of the ASEAN Regional Forum Experts and Eminent Persons Group. He is also a founding member and former co-chair of the Multinational Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific. He is a political, military affairs, and national security specialist with more than 50 years of experience in analyzing U.S. Asia-Pacific security policy. And Professor COSSA is a frequent contributor to regional newspapers and journals as well. He is a retired USAF military officer who served as a special assistant to two US Pacific Command commanders, and he also served as a national security fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Dr. COSSA holds a BA in International Relations from Syracuse University, an MBA from Pepperdine University, an MS in Strategic Studies from the Defense Intelligence College, and an honorary doctorate in international relations from the University of Cambodia for his lifetime work in promoting peace and stability in East Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present to you Dr. Ralph COSSA for his lecture this morning.
Well, Enrico, thank you very much, and aloha to everyone. Good morning to my friends in the Philippines. It's actually Friday afternoon here in Hawaii, but I look forward to the day when I can get back to the Philippines and visit many old friends. I want to say just a couple of words about Pacific Forum and programs that might interest you before going into a discussion of US-China relations. The Pacific Forum is a nonprofit research institute. We're nonpartisan. We find ways of criticizing both Republicans and Democrats, whoever happens to be in power, but also try to explain US foreign policy as best as we understand it, so that if you still dislike the US, at least you're doing it for the right reasons and not for the wrong reasons. One thing that may be of interest to many of your listeners, we have had a young leaders program where we bring young people in their 20s and early 30s to sit in on senior level dialogues. And if that program would interest you, you can find more about it at www.pacforum.org. I just sent that address out into the chat room so that you would have it, and also put my own personal email there if you have any questions or if you want more information or to be on the Pacific Forum's mailing list. We're very happy to add you. Well, let's get on to the topic at hand, which is US-China relations. I'm sure you will hear different perspectives from myself and Zhu Feng, although we are both old friends and enjoy talking with one another and debating with one another. In my own view, the US and China have been on a collision course for the last several years. No one wants an actual collision, but I think we all worry about accidental conflict because neither side seems to be willing to blink at the current time. The US policy today is essentially cooperate where we can, compete where we should, and confront where we must. And while all the time avoiding the fourth C, which is conflict. And I think that's generally the guidelines. It was very much the same during the Trump administration, and quite frankly, even during the Obama administration. But I want to talk a little bit about how we got to where we are today, and then where we are and where I think or hope that we can go. So how did we get here? Well, I think that both sides share in the blame. I think there's been a lot of mismanagement and misunderstandings and lack of real comprehension of the other's motives and wishes. But at the end of the day, I blame one leader more than others. A leader who I think has been very egotistical, very overly nationalistic, and one who thinks tactically rather than strategically. And for those of you who think I'm talking about Donald Trump, I'm not. I think Mr. Trump has made things worse in many respects, and the current administration is trying to, I think, correct and get back on a better path. But I really think that the real problem has rested with Xi Jinping and China's leadership. What we have seen, in my own view, is the death of Deng Xiaoping thought in China. Those of you who study China understand that Deng's dictum to his Chinese comrades was hide your strength and bide your time. Focus on a peaceful rise. It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. In other words, socialism with Chinese characteristics, which was very much imbued with the open market. It was also focused on having a collective leadership to prevent another strong man like Mao Zedong from taking control and potentially leading the country in the wrong direction, as Deng and others thought Mao had done. Virtually all of Deng Xiaoping's guidelines have been rejected and replaced in China in the last 10 years. One country, two systems, which was supposed to be the formula for Hong Kong that would make it attractive also to Taiwan, was officially buried with the national security laws that essentially allows China to impose its laws on Hong Kong, despite a legally binding, registered at the UN agreement between the UK and China over the reversion of Hong Kong. It still doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it follows Xi Jinping thought. And clearly what we've seen with the wolf warrior diplomats has been a dictum of China is a big country and you're not, in talking to many of its neighbors, and certainly an increased aggressiveness on the part of China. In my own view, I think that Chairman Xi Jinping has been tactically very clever, but strategically very foolish. I say this because he apparently had very little tolerance for people in Hong Kong speaking out against the party or speaking out against China. He has solved that problem. People in Hong Kong now are afraid to speak out. But what he has also done is remind the rest of the world that China's word is really not very good, that it does not honor its international agreements. And this has caused many countries to be worried about China, and has in fact lowered the opinion of China throughout much of the world. We've seen the same thing, regrettably, with Taiwan. China has been conducting lots of flights against Taiwan into the Taiwan Air Defense Identification Zone. The message there is, don't forget that China is a big country and you better behave. The message that's been received by the rest of the world is that China is a bully. It's threatening Taiwan, which has not done anything to deserve the threats. And as a result, you've seen the international community led by the United States, but certainly not only the United States, rallying to the support of Chinese democracy in Taiwan. We saw the same thing with after the Australians had the audacity to ask that there be a comprehensive investigation into the origins of COVID, which most of the world believes began in Wuhan. China began punishing Australia and in doing so, violating the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement. This has caused some economic hardship in Australia. It has also caused Australia to revitalize efforts to rebuild the Quad, linking the US, Australia with Japan and India. And now China is, of course, complaining about this organization, despite the fact that they are, in many respects, responsible for having it occurred. So there's where I think the initial problem lied, was in essentially Deng Xiaoping's dictums being set aside and a more aggressive and assertive China coming to the fore. And what we see now, I think, is the United States and others reacting to that. I think in some respects, Mr. Trump overreacted. He also never saw a problem that he didn't think tariffs could solve. This created, I think, more problems. And when his initial foreign policy team, which was led by General Mattis and by General McMaster at the Security Council, were replaced by Secretary Pompeo and by John Bolton, among others, at the National Security Council, the focus went from being against Chinese behavior to being against Chinese ideology. There was a very strong anti-communist tone to the US policy during the last 2 years of the Trump administration. And to me, this was counterproductive. The problem is not Chinese ideology, the problem has been Chinese behavior. And I think international pressure could have been sufficient to change Chinese behavior. But it was not going to change Chinese ideology, since this is the basis and the source of the current leadership's credibility and credentials. So to attack the Chinese party as opposed to attacking Chinese behavior, I think made it counterproductive, and also made it harder for countries who would otherwise want to support this effort. Countries like Vietnam, for instance, that has several thousand years of hardships with China. But if you attack communist ideology, of course, Vietnam is going to take that personally. So I think that Mr. Trump made things worse rather than better in his own approach. But in many respects, he was very much reacting to what we saw coming from China. I think Mr. Biden is now trying to get on a more even path. He is still, like most American Democrats with a big D, very much in favor of the promotion of democracy, and has talked about a league of democracies or a gathering of democracies that I guess is going to happen before the end of the year. But the rhetoric about the problems with China being ideology have, I think, toned down correctly. And the focus has, I think, returned to Chinese behavior and essentially to insisting on a level playing field with China. Don't expect the US to allow China to do things in the United States that American businesses or American citizens or news outlets are not allowed to do in China. I think a policy that is based primarily on behavior and on reciprocity makes a lot more sense, and I think will have a greater following in the international community, particularly as I think Chinese pressure in many areas grows. I know the Philippines have had their own challenges with China. They had their hopes up at one point. I think Mr. Duterte believed that he could outsmart Xi Jinping. Turns out he can't and hasn't. And all of these dreams of billions and billions of Chinese dollars coming in to help the Philippine economy have not come to pass. And at the same time, China has not eased up on its own claims in the South China Sea, and certainly has not done anything that would show any kind of respect for Philippine claims. So I think that's where we are today. Where do we go from here? Well, the good news is, much to the surprise of the international community, and myself included, 2 days ago at the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, the US and China introduced a joint statement talking about the need for both to cooperate together on greenhouse gases. Whether or not this will actually prove fruitful in the end of the day, I think remains to be seen, but it was good news at any rate that showed that the two governments were talking with one another and had found at least one area of common concern where we could build some cooperation. I think there are other areas of common concern where we need to build cooperation. One of those is dealing with North Korea. No one wants to see a war on the Korean Peninsula. Certainly, no one sleeps well at night knowing that the North Koreans have nuclear weapons that they might use or that they might also export, which brings to another common objective, which is preventing proliferation. If a group like ISIS got their hands on a dirty bomb, on a jar full of plutonium that they could mix with high explosives, it's just as likely, maybe even more likely, that that might be exploded in Xinjiang as in San Francisco. So again, these are areas where our interests overlap. It was very discouraging, quite frankly, when Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman met with Chinese counterparts in August. She stressed the areas where our interests overlap. And the Chinese response essentially was, here's a list of 14 things you need to do if you want to be friends with us. And until that happens, don't expect us to cooperate on anything, even where our interests overlap. This is very self-defeating. It's sort of North Korea's tactics being adopted by China, which I think serves no one's interest. It doesn't serve US interest, but doesn't serve China's interest either. Again, the announcement at COP26 gives some hope in the other direction. And the most important announcement was that President Xi and President Obama will be meeting virtually next week. I think they can put the relationship back on track. They can set the proper tone, one that will acknowledge that there will be competition, but there should also be cooperation where our goals overlap. So let me stop with those opening comments. I look forward to hearing my friend Zhu Feng, and then most of all to hearing questions and comments from the audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those very insightful comments, Dr. Ralph Cossa. Indeed, no, Dr. Ralph Cossa provided us with like an overview of the shape, if you will, of the current US-China relations. And if I may, I would just like to highlight some of the very important points that he has shared with us this morning. Dr. Cossa's lecture, I think, started with this very thought-provoking assertion, if you will, that the real problem in US-China relations right now is basically the assertiveness of Xi Jinping, no, abandoning the approach of Deng Xiaoping, which is Tao Guangyang Hui and pursuing a more assertive wolf warrior diplomacy approach. So that is very interesting to know this year. And to quote Dr. Kosa, Xi Jinping is basically tactically being clever, but strategically being foolish, with little tolerance to democracy, especially for advocates in Hong Kong, an assertive change in China's Taiwan policy, and the recent engagement with Australia, where basically sanctions-like measures were adopted against Australia. And then Dr. Kosa's lecture shifted on focusing on basically how Donald Trump made things worse. No? So the important point there is that Donald Trump basically started criticizing China's ideology and the party, which is counterproductive to actually trying to change Chinese behavior, and basically inviting everyone in the international sphere to launch a concerted effort in engaging with China. So Trump basically made it worse. But Dr. Costa made it clear that Trump is basically just being reactive to the assertive tendencies of Xi Jinping. And then moving on to President Biden, well, President Biden's emphasis on the promotion of democracy and Chinese behavior is a right step forward, according to him. And he segued a little bit on the implications for the Philippines, where I think he articulated what I think is the popular opinion right now, and that is Duterte really not getting the upper hand of the deal with Xi Jinping at the expense rather of Philippine national interests. So that's a very interesting point that he raised on Philippine foreign policy. And lastly, where do we go from here then? I think Dr. Cosa was very optimistic in highlighting, for instance, the developments in the COP26, COP meeting. So where both leaders introduced a joint statement on environmental cooperations. And we are looking forward to the upcoming meeting as well between Xi Jinping and Obama, and how it could probably provide new opportunities for cooperation between the two powers. So those are very insightful observations made by Dr. Ralph Costa, and I expect that Dr. Chufang on his part would be able to provide interesting insights as well on the current major power dynamics. Before we proceed with Dr. Chufang's presentation for this morning, allow me to formally introduce our next speaker. Professor Chu Fang is Executive Dean of the School of International Studies at Nanjing University in Nanjing, China. He is also currently serving as the Executive Director of the Center for Collaborative Studies of the South China Sea at Nanjing University. Dr. Chu Fang is specializing in the Asia Pacific regional security, and he is a very prolific scholar on maritime security affairs, China US Japan relations, and North Korean nuclear proliferation issue, having written several books on these topics. His book, China's Ascent, Power, Security, and International Politics, which is co-edited with Professor Robert Ross, is widely cited in the studies of Chinese foreign policy. And among his recent works as well on international politics include his co-edited volume with Professor John Eikenberry and Professor Wang Jisi, which is titled America, China, and Struggle for the World Order. Also his 2016 book entitled The Sea Power in the 21st Century, Historical Lessons and China Challenge. And perhaps something that would interest our audience here today, he has also written a co-edited book with Professor Yu Min Tsai titled Re-Examination of the 2016 Arbitral Ruling over the South China Sea Disputes. So definitely our next speaker is very well versed on the issue of major power dynamics in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce our next speaker for today, Professor Chu Fang.
Thank you, Professor Gloria, for your very kind introduction. I really learned a lot from Dr. Koza's presentation. From my personal perspective, I see some sort of very comprehensive conclusion to the deterioration of bilateral relations between Beijing and Washington. Of course, it's totally go against Dr. COSSA's conclusion. The reason is, of course, is very simple. For example, so Chinese current leadership, yes, is quite different from the previous one. But the problem is Chinese top leader Xi Jinping was a baby boom generation of Chinese leadership. So of course, in terms of his educational background and even personal growing, backdrop, of course, he is doomed to be different from previous leaders. So then, yes, I see current government show some sort of new tendencies and a new preference in handling the China's foreign policy as well as China's domestic politics. But to be honest, I couldn't just conclude current leadership is go more assertive. Yes, I also see, for example, Xi's foreign policy just very overwhelmingly focusing on defending the China's interests. But the problem is, then a lot of China's assertive just originally result from some sort of growing pressure and pushing back from the U.S. For example, from the Obama administration, it's a second term, U.S. also call on the pivoting back to Asia, and also just keep China on lock for some sort of such a assertive revisionist power. But Beijing very spontaneously, we didn't just contain such a the branding is really could be faithful to recapture China's foreign policy. On the other hand, where was see Americans' policy of the South China Sea also dramatically changed. 20 years ago, USA, Washington has no opinion on who is more entitled to claim some sort of such a contentious, rockets and ISOs. But the problem is then just 10 years ago, Americans' policy is completely shifted. US is definitely just and firmly at the opposite to China and very, very strongly condemning the China's claim of all, the sovereignty and maritime claims. So why, the US policy of the South China Sea such a dramatically changed from my perspective, because US is highly aware the Chinese naval capability increased. So probably China will just become some sort of a competing force in West Pacific. So it's just definitely due to the Americans' anxiety to the China's growing naval capability. So Americans' policy of the South China Sea, such a very contentious sovereign claims is also dramatically changed. But the problem is such a change really left the China in some sort of very, uneasy and very, very agitating, we say, place, because we don't know why the Americans, some sort of such a policy of South China Seas, sovereignty claim, well, just such a dramatic change. It's not based on the rule. It's just based on Americans' self-interest. Of course, such a change just forced China to what? To stand up. So then such a China's standing up is also very interestingly interpreted as China's small assertiveness. It's some sort of native circle. It's just definitely and simply created and made by US alone. But the problem is where China's interest is, how it could be also very equally and even fairly just we say confirmed in Americans' policy change. We couldn't see any clue. US will really just could reposition itself in some sort of relatively fair and justified, the standards. So then, of course, all such Americans' policy change. My view is that forcefully just the gate Beijing to what? Also to take some sort of such a new situation. in some sort of, we say, a more positively way. So then I see such a circle is really, really mutually some sort of stimulating and even mutually just deteriorating. So that's why my view is that from this case studies, so it's totally unfair to just put the finger to the China's nose. Then we will see how the South China Sea issue is also getting more unstable and even stirringly, we say, risky. It's not just the China alone. It's some sort of full progress, just driven some sort of a vicious cycle. But second point I want to share with you is in what way we can explain some sort of such a collision course now is just taking place between Beijing and Washington. Personally, I don't think it's just that China should just how say get some sort of such a condemnation. I see a lot of reason happening on the American side. So to my understand, a couple of the factors is also very clearly just the House emerging to force the US change its China policy in a very, very assertive way. First is it's a narrow the power gap between Beijing and Washington. This year is a 42, we say, anniversary of the normalization of the diplomatic relations between China and Washington. 42 years ago, when the Carter administration decided to normalize relations with Beijing, I think Washington is very, very positively agree on the Taiwan issue in the China's turn. For example, the normalization with Beijing should just how say ending in the Americans' termination of the alliance treaty with the Taipei and the withdrawing of all American troops from the Taiwan, and also we say closing the Americans' embassy in Taipei as well. So then, yes, it's also very positive, you know, the concession from the Carter administration. Then it also gets both sides finally just to conclude the diplomatic normalization, getting back to in 1972. But how big China's GDP was back to in 1972 to the US, it's just less than 4%. That time China was so smaller, weaker in front of American friends. So then the US really didn't take China seriously as some sort of potential threat. Most importantly, get back to the 1978 and 79, the Soviet Union was a common enemy for Washington and Beijing. So we needed to teaming up against the Soviet Union's, you know, assertive foreign policy. So then Beijing and Washington, not just how say return to the diplomatic relations, we also become even quasi-allies back to the almost the entire 80s. But the problem is when we see what's the proportional relations between Beijing and Washington over the GDP. I think last year Americans' economy was 77.7% in a downward, whereas the China's GDP just 2.3 upward. So by the end of last year, China's GDP also just took account of Americans won for 70.4%. So then we see what's some sort of a big power jump by China from 22 years ago over to now. So then I see today China has been very firmly locked up as the only country in this century, which could be what? Could be just how say getting closer to the Americans' mind, and even over the time, no one can exclude the possibility China and the United States will become peer competitors. So I see such a leading change with the power gap between the two countries is really decisive and a defining factor to force the US to change the points of China. then the US just take China as the #1 strategic competitor and even potential strategic adversaries. It's just due to some sort of such a power calculation. Then I think almost 30 years ago, after the demise of the Soviet Union, there was a very interesting debate within the US. Who will be the second biggest power in the world? I think there was a lot of interesting speculation, but China was just at the end of a long list. But today, there is no suspicion at all. If this century there will be country, could be just becoming some sort of peer competitor to the US. It's just China. So then my view is that such a power calculation overwhelmingly changed the Americans' China policy. Then second reason I think is also very, very important. It's Americans' domestic, political and social division and even political chaos. Then there was a very, very interesting consensus among the Americans, strategists and policy elites. If the US was stuck in domestic division and the domestic chaos, then who will be benefiting from such Americans' domestic, disorder and disarray? It's just the #2 biggest power in the world. It's the China. So then there's a growing, I think, the fear. So there's no way US could just open a new window for China to speed up the power catch up or power match up from the US. So in return, US should just keep the China punch, keep the China slash, keep the China on the Americans, very, very devastating, pushing back. So then I see it's American domestic factor. Then the US should just close any window of opportunity to get to China just re-emerging more quickly and more powerfully against the backdrop among Americans' domestic, such a division and even domestic chaos. Then related to this, there is another very interesting point now is also very, very prevalent throughout Americans' politics and the policy community. That means getting tougher to China could be a very useful factor to get the polarized the United States reunified. Such a view is not hitting the Republicans, but also has a huge market among the Democrats. So getting tougher to China, making good use of the China factor to rebuild the reunifications of Americans' domestic politics. So then what's the China factor? China factor becomes some sort of recalibrator for America's political reunification, political recohesion. I'm really feel very sad. That's a domestic politics right now is not just trying to making a great use of China factor. Then such a domestic politics driven, getting China policy, tougher policy, become also very, very utilitarian, become a very, very, we say some sort of, we say well-calculated American political plot. So under such a circumstances, China has been greatly victimized. I really feel very sad. What's the China-US relations? In history, the US helped bring China up. My generation of Chinese scholar got a lot of the education and even thoughtful inspirations from my senior American colleagues. When I was the bachelor students and a master student, I went to study in the US as an exchange, joining the exchange student programs. So my generation got a lot of, just as I mentioned, inspirations from Americans, professors and scholars. So we're really, really know how to thankful to such a relationship. As I mentioned, so largely in the past 40 years, then the US helped bring the China up. So we don't want to just compete in the US in a very vicious manner. We also don't want US to take the China as the #1 enemy, because looking at the power gap, we're still far behind the US. We still want to just going up. We still want to getting stronger in terms of the China's per capita. We're still dreaming of China could become some sort of a developed country rather than developing country. Yes, past 40 years, no country would prove to be the most successful than China in economic advancement. But how China achieved that? Yes, it's a Chinese model. It's a Chinese way. Yes, US say, you are not the liberal democracy. You are not some sort of westernized with a rule of law country. Well, we're not just how they feel any just how they uneasy. The Chinese way, Chinese model. It get the Chinese better off so tremendously, just based on the Chinese culture, based on Chinese traditionality, based on China's, the economic, social, and political reality. So we're not shy away from some sort of such a Chinese pursuit of the Chinese model. Yes, in the eyes of many American friends, China's top leader, Xi, maybe is some sort of controversial figure. But you know what kind of a historical contribution he did in the past 10 years to get China's domestic corruption is really very, very, decisively just fought against, and China's common prosperity also just improved a lot. China's some sort of a political, we say, cleaning, against the corruption, turned out to be the most successful throughout the Deng's era, Jiang's era, and Hu Jintao's era. So China's top leader Xi become unpopular, become unmatchable in his popularity and his support in domestic China. So that's why I think a certain reason finally gets the US or China into the collision course is our different political views. From the Chinese view, we consider the most important and fitable Chinese way to get us better off is based on China's reality. So we really know how, for example, liberty and rule of law in a Western standard is still illuminating to Chinese. But China is still unfinished transitional power. We should make the Chinese way ahead, step by step. But at least the current China's domestic rule, China's domestic governance has never been better in the past 4 decades. In terms of its economic achievement, in terms of the less corruptions, in terms of its some sort of emphasis on the common prosperity and the social equality. So that's why, from our American friends' perspective, China's problem is definitely to the Chinese leadership, but China's people's answer is no. So then my conclusion is this. Yes, next Monday's, virtual summit meeting will be very interesting. We are very looking forward to, but I have no hope at all. Such a one single virtual summit meeting will overwhelmingly just turn the China-US relations into some sort of soundtrack. Yeah, I'm less positive to that, but at least such a virtual summit meeting could help bring a floor to what? To continuously devastating US-China relations. We need some sort of a responsible relationship. It's not a responsible stakeholder at all, but we need a responsible and fairly, competing relationship between the two powers. We need also the US could just have a serious look at what is China's domestic dynamics. US also could just not just have say talking your China policy perfectly or simply from your views. You can also keep the Chinese view, Chinese people's view well listened. So then I really hope China-US relations could just have a well-managed, less risky, and more what? More responsible, rule-based, some sort of such a competition or interaction. But anyway, before some sort of a better formality of our relationship could be on the way, both of our sides needed to take a more serious look at our relations after all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhu Fang, for that equally insightful lecture on highlighting China's side on this US-China strategic competition. And just like what I did with Professor COSSA, I would like to highlight some of the important points that Professor Zhu Fang has shared to us this morning. So Professor Chu Fang's lecture started with a very interesting premise on why, for instance, Xi Jinping is approaching US-China relations in a different way. And an important point that he raised is basically the difference in contexts, considering that Xi Jinping, for instance, is a baby boomer or part of the baby boomer part of Chinese elite leadership. So that is a very important point, emphasizing Xi Jinping's personal background and context. And I guess, of course, strikingly different from Professor Cossa's lecture, uh, Professor Chu Fang was basically asserting, and I think this is the main point of his lecture, that China is the one who is in the reactive position. So he claims that US policy has dramatically changed over time precisely because of this growing anxiety on the behalf of the United States when it comes to appreciating the power gap between the two major powers. No? So, and in a way, it only forced China to stand up or to basically pursue a policy that is mostly perceived as being assertive. And to a certain extent, no, Professor Zhu Fang was not friendly to the idea of calling China an assertive power. It's basically reacting to the assertiveness of US foreign policy. So he has also emphasized that China basically do not deserve the sole condemnation on, having this very competitive dynamics between between the two major powers. He provided us with 3 points on why he think the United States is the problem in this dynamics. No? First, again, as I have mentioned, is this perception of a narrowing power gap between the two powers. Second, would be American domestic and political division, which basically is perceived as I guess challenge, if you will, for the United States to pose an effective uh, competition for China. And to a certain extent, a third reason would be this particular political divide in the United States is actually becoming an impetus to forward a more combative China policy, right? Because both sides, the Democrats and the Republicans, believe or are united in that idea that China is or should be assertively approached, if you will. So, and I think in conclusion, Professor Chu Fang asserted that China is still a developing country focused on promoting a Chinese way of bringing development and prosperity to its citizens. He also highlighted that Xi Jinping has basically is an effective leader, if you will, in China as it's able to combat Chinese corruption, improve the prospects for Chinese prosperity, and basically overall popular in China. So um, the accusations are, for at least in his point of view, are invalid. No? So those are very interesting points that Professor Zhu Fang has added to our conversation this morning on US-China competition. And right now, we can definitely open the floor for comments and questions to this very interesting topic. If you have questions, I invite you to personally address them to our speakers for today. Or if you prefer typing them in the chat box, that is also okay. And at this point, I would like to invite everyone, if you can turn on your video cameras for our open forum for today, that would be much appreciated. So, yeah, that's it for me. And we can begin the round of questions and comments for today's lecture. Anyone who'd like to start? All right, I have here a first question from Min Soo Kim. It was directly chatted to me, and I would like to read it for our speakers. So, Min Soo Kim writes, as stated by Dr. COSSA, China is tactically clever but strategically foolish. Isn't it only right that China is showing cautiousness in the regions, especially with the West's military alliances, their blacklisting of Chinese companies, even detaining an executive due to suspicions? The West's pivot to Asia policy is an outward or far-reaching policy. So my question is China's actions justified with all these taken into account? Would China not would China not act this way given the West do not act with hostility as well? So I can send it to everyone. Hold on, because it's a bit long. Right. Uh, I'll read it one more time, and I think this is better addressed to Dr. Chufang, but Dr. Kosa can definitely also respond. Again, as stated by Dr. Kosa, China is tactically clever but strategically foolish. Isn't it only right that China is showing cautiousness in the region, especially with the West's military alliances, their blacklisting of Chinese companies, even detaining an executive due to suspicions? The West's pivot to Asia policy is an outward or far-reaching policy. So my question is China's actions justified with all these taken into account? Would China not act with this way given the West do not act with hostility as well? So anyone from our speakers would like to respond? Yes, Dr. Chufang, floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Gloria. That's a very interesting question. So then I think Dr. Kosa's observation is very interesting, but somehow I think his view is very, very cleverly reflecting Americans' points in determining what China is reposture of itself of a lot of policy area. But the problem is, it seemed to me, as I mentioned, so China's current leadership is very stylish. You know, it's a very strong character, strongly characterized the Chinese leadership. So they also have their calculations, their view. But basically, I see such a points remain very well predictable. For example, so China, yes, a lot of accusation of China's assertiveness over the South China Sea, but the problem is our diplomatic and political relations still move ahead. So then I just want to say two things. One, when you just have a clear and even smart observation of the Chinese foreign policy, I think two things is very important. One is you should just take the notes of some sort of such a nuanced, difference between such a policy implications for the domestic audience and some sort of such a policy messages for international audience. So today, China is just more careful about such a rebalancing between the two audience. So then, on the one hand, for the example, the Beijing policy just trying to showcasing the Chinese people, we are very determined to defend the China's claim defend China's position. But on the other hand, I think like for the international audience, China also make it clear, I think like very necessary. China will still just follow firmly with China's peaceful rise. So we will not just how say derailed very badly for any assertive or aggressive, posture. So then it's a point, first a point. The second is, I see such a very stylish Chinese foreign policy thinking and making. Usually probably will leave the impression China is in a very strong posture. But the problem is, I don't think, for example, some sort of such a tactical advancement of the China's interest in maintaining will definitely equal to the China's strategy overall changed. For example, yes, China's some sort of we say the maritime police scholarship usually just how say patrol the South China Sea, but I don't think it's really break the status quo. Also, what just how say equally mean some sort of forceful imposition of the Chinese claim to our neighbor countries. So then most of such a interaction by the maritime policing ships usually is seen to me is more symbolic than substance. So then that's why I always say, yes, we couldn't just easily conclude that China's policy is overwhelmingly assertiveness. We should recognize such a two nuanced difference. One is China's domestic requirements. On the other hand, we also would like to see that with the China's growing such a tactical capability, then some sort of China's international movements probably will sound a little bit forceful, but I see no substantive change with such a policy outcome and the real goal setting. So then, as I mentioned, it's some sort, mostly it's a more symbolic than substance. So that's why I consider there's no single and easy piece we can pick it up to justify some sort of China's overall policy change. China's way usually always goes this. It should be a very delicate balance between domestic and international. It should be a very interesting balance between the leadership's personality and even some sort of well reception or better reception among the domestic audience. So then I think having a very clear overlook at the China's foreign policy required them anytime ever to the China's domestic political realities. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, go ahead,
let
Professor.
me add a few words if I can. First of all, let me say that I believe that Zhu Feng believes sincerely in everything that he is saying. But I think that some of his perceptions are incorrect. And certainly they don't coincide with my perceptions, and I'll share mine with you, and then the audience can be the judge. The question sort of implied that US alliances are threatening to China. But if you read US alliances, they are all defensive in nature. The US alliance is not aimed at supporting Philippine claims in the South China Sea. It is not aimed at supporting Japan against China or South Korea against China. They are aimed at defending the Philippines. They're aimed at defending Japan and Korea. And I am asked many times by Chinese colleagues, is the US-Japan alliance anti-China? And my answer, quite honestly, is not yet, but it's getting close. And the reason it's getting close is that China is becoming more and more threatening to Japan. Is the the US-Philippine alliance anti-China? No, but the US-Philippine alliance says that if Philippine facilities or forces or installations are attacked, this will invoke the alliance. So if China does not intend on attacking any of these, then the alliance is not against China. If China does attack, then the alliance becomes against China, not because the US or the Philippines wants it to be, but because China has forced it to be. Let me talk just a little bit about US policy in the South China Sea, because from my perspective, US policy has not changed. The US has always supported freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Philippine colleagues can look in their history books or in historical newspapers to see the number of times that the Philippines have protested to US sailing through the archipelago, demonstrating a freedom of seas against the Philippines and against Indonesia and against Malaysia and others. There is a principle of international straits being international straits and reminding countries that they are international straits and open to other navies. Before the Chinese invented new territory in the South China Sea by building islands on top of low tide elevations, there was no need for the US to be sailing by a bunch of reefs to demonstrate freedom of navigation. When the Chinese claimed in direct contravention to UNCLOS that somehow or other these low tide elevations now deserve to have a 12-mile limit and an economic zone, the US and others, Australia, the UK, France, and many other countries have sailed through there just to remind China that you cannot create new facts on the ground. You cannot create an island in the middle of a bunch of reefs and then start claiming territorial waters on it. So the change has been in Chinese behavior, not in US policy. The US policy has stayed the same. We still don't take a position on who owns the islands, but we do believe that it needs to be settled peacefully and that laws of UNCLOS apply. The US has not signed or ratified UNCLOS, but it does state very clearly that it is prepared to live by those rules and follow those rules. And you simply cannot create an island where none existed before and then claim territorial sovereignty over that. You also can't pull out a Republic of China map from the 1940s with a bunch of dotted lines on it and claim that you now own the South China Sea. I have an old map in my office, shows the Mongol Empire. Back in the 1400s, Mongolia owned all of China. So if we want to use history as a guide, we can say that Mongolia owns China and owns the South China Sea. That's, of course, preposterous. But so is a 9-dash line map that doesn't even indicate what the dashed line is for. And traditionally, dashed lines do not demonstrate sovereignty. That's what solid lines are aimed at doing. Again, I think that we've heard many Chinese complaints recently about the Quad involving, the US and Australia and Japan and India. If you read the statements that came out of the Quad meetings, the Quad summits, you will not see the word China mentioned. What you will hear is a commitment to the rule of law, a commitment to freedom of navigation, a commitment to free and open trade, a commitment to respecting sovereignty of small countries. Our Chinese colleagues then say, oh yeah, that means you're against China. But if that means we're against China, it means that China is against all of those things. So China should be looking in a mirror to ask themselves why, when they hear rule of law, do they interpret that as anti-China? Why, when they hear the word freedom of navigation, they interpret that as anti-China? Why is China against those principles? Zhu Feng mentioned a rules-based order. That's what we're all in favor of. And if China is prepared to live by a rules-based order, live by the same economic and political rules that help China rise, we would all be better off. I think China deserves a great deal of credit for the amount of development, the lifting of people out of poverty. But let's not forget that that was made possible because of the opening up to the West. It was US and Japanese and Korean and European direct investment in China that helped China rise. These aren't the actions of a country that's trying to contain or bully China. There was a grand bargain, and that grand bargain was that we would help China rise in an interconnected fashion so that China would turn out to be the Germany of the second half of the 20th century and not the Germany of the first half of the 20th century. But today, we have to ask ourselves, which Germany is China acting like? And that, I think, has been the real concern. So I'm sorry, my answer was probably too long, but I wanted to get those points out.
Thank you so much, Professor COSSA, for equally insightful contributions. Now, the discussions right now are currently very interesting, and I'm sure many of you in the audience have some follow-up questions and comments. So again, I'm opening the floor. Who wants to comment or ask a question on those contributions? All right. I have here a question from directly sent to me. It's anonymous. But first, I encourage everyone, especially the students here. This is a very rare opportunity for you to actually pick the brains, if you will, of our distinguished speakers for today. So for the students, I encourage you to prepare your questions as well. But before that, let's have this anonymous question. So I will read it. If China shares in the belief of a rule-based order, but tends to disagree on the interpretation of these rules, does China have an interest to establish its own rules in the international community? Again, I'll read it one more time. If China shares in the belief of a rules-based order, but tends to disagree on the interpretation of these rules, does China have an interest to establish its own rules in the international community? I'll send it in the chat box as well. Professor Zhu Feng, would you like to take that question?
Okay, good. Of course, it's a big controversy over how to interpret the rule-based order. For example, I totally believe that China's behavior to the South China Sea should be very, very, apparently and also firmly based on rule-based order. But what's the rule? For example, so yes, arbitral ruling is part of a rule. But the problem then we say UN Convention of Sea, UN law of sea, of course, is part of a rule. But we also have a different, international legal sources to refer to some sort of rule. So then rule is not just narrowly interpreted by some sort of certain documents. And also the rule is not just definitely just restrained on some countries' arguments. So then I think most importantly, not just the House of feel that China is seemed just to take a hold very tightly over the Chinese interpretation, but we also have some sort of legal reference. We also have some sort of useful legal sources then we will see, for example, historical rise is also equal to some sort of historical sea bay, such a maritime entitlement. So then it's a very controversial and a debatable question. But the way is, as I mentioned, so China couldn't just have to exclude it from any some sort of a rule-based order. And in reverse, China should be a very, very, strong, upholder to the rule of law. So then, but the problem is, just as I mentioned, the controversy now is just taking place on what kind of the sources of the rule should be very powerfully and legally just applying to in the interpretation. I see there's a lot of controversies over there. So then my suggestion is, don't just take all some sort of individual country based such a rule, advocacy as some sort of a universal. We also need some sort of a rule of law, just open for discussion, open for some sort of collective, exploitation. So I understand, for example, Americans' advocacy of what the rule is and how the rule of a base could just advance. But the problem is, Chinese view also deserve some sort of, weighing and a serious listening. So then, first of all, as I mentioned, so rule of law is also part of the indispensable interest of my country, of China. But on the other hand, how to just ease down the controversy of the rule of law, we need some sort of get into some sort of open and inclusive new policy debate.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead.
I would not disagree with most of what my friend Zhu Feng has said. I do think that rules-based order does not mean the US makes the rules and China has to follow them. I think rules-based order means that all countries need to reach agreement on issues and then honor those agreements. And there needs to be judicatory and enforcement measures included. UNCLOS is a good example. I think that there are differences in interpretation between the US and China and others regarding UNCLOS. But there are also international courts that are responsible for interpreting those differences. And we did have an international court that said there is no legal basis to China's 9-dash lines. And China has rejected that. There are dispute mechanisms within the WTO. But when China joined the WTO, it made a pledge to phase out state-owned enterprises. That was another one of Deng Xiaoping's guidelines. That's been neglected and dishonored as well, as state-owned enterprises have now become more important again in China. So the question is not who makes the rules. The question is, if you agree to the rules, then honor them. The same holds true with Hong Kong, as I mentioned before. China made some very specific promises to the UK in return for the UK turning Hong Kong over to China. One of those was the right of final adjudication in Hong Kong. Another was popular elections, presumably by about 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And China has not honored these agreements. So the problem is not America makes the rules and China has to follow them. The problem is that China has agreed to certain rules. China has participated in the development of many of these rules. But then even where there have been bilateral treaties, like the treaty between China and Australia on free trade, China has just arbitrarily decided, because they are angry at Australia for asking for a full accounting on COVID origin, that somehow or other Australia has to do a list of 12 things before China will honor the agreements that it made with Australia. I think this is the real problem regarding a rule of law today. And when a country, and there have been cases where countries have taken the United States to the WTO and other instruments and said, you're not honoring this agreement, and where that's been proven true, the US has been required to change. So it's a matter not just of making rules, but of honoring them. In the South China Sea, as Yufeng very well knows, we had a declaration on the conduct of parties in the South China Sea. And when was it? 2002. That was supposed to be followed by a code of conduct. Here it is, almost 20 years later. There's still no code of conduct in the South China Sea. And if one is developed, it is very unlikely that it will have any kind of enforcement mechanism or any type of, adjudicatory factor in it to indicate that people are violating it. So the problem is not the rule of law. The problem is people just not following the rules. In the South China Sea, I think China makes the case legitimately that they are not the only ones who have violated the DOC. A lot of the claimants have violated it, but no one has violated it to the extent and to the awareness of China. So, these are the problems. Countries have to behave, and when they don't honor their commitments, it's not being anti-China or anti-American or anti-anyone else to point out you promised A, B, and C and you haven't done it. This is what you should expect if you're a modern country that subscribes to rule by law.
Thank you very much for those comments. Would anyone else like to contribute to that discussion on the rule of law? All right. We have questions coming here in our chat box. I would like to go first for the question of Dr. Lucio Pitlo to everyone. So I think it is addressed in the chat box now. So I will read it for everyone. Strategic competition with China is now high in US policy, and Southeast Asia is a key theater. However, US response to the China challenge still seems to be as overly securitized, strong on defense but fall short on economic goods. Blue Dot Network, Economic Prosperity Network, Build Back Better World were initiatives seen to counter China's Belt and Road, but they have yet to hit the ground. RCEP, wherein China is part of, will take effect next year, while it remains to be seen whether US will rejoin CPTPP. What are the prospects of US enhancing the economic leg of its competitive strategy? So I guess that's the gist of the question. No? What are the prospects of US enhancing the economic leg of its competitive strategy? And again, that's from Mr. Lucio Pitlo. My apologies for that. I guess it's addressed primarily to Dr. COSSA. Would you like to respond, sir? Yeah.
What are the prospects? I think, in a word, slim. I think this is one of the great shortcomings of US strategy in Asia. It's certainly the United States is an economic player in Asia and has been for decades through the Asian Development Bank and others. So it's not like the US is doing nothing, but it lost a great opportunity with the TPP when Mr. Trump walked away from it, and where Secretary Clinton, had she become president, also said she was going to walk away from it. This is an area where domestic US politics has made effective foreign policy almost impossible. And it's a very fair criticism. It's a criticism. I could have written the same question and same complaint because I think it is a good one. I think after the midterm elections, there's a chance that the U.S. may try to come back into the TPP. It's going to take political courage, and that has been in short supply in D.C. and in a lot of different areas. I do believe, however, that the prospects of China joining the CPTPP are almost non-existent. I'm not sure that China was even serious in the application, or whether it was just trying to play psychological warfare with the US. If that's the case, it's a fair shot. But for a country to join the TPP requires unanimous consent. The Australians, among others, have made it very clear that as long as China is engaging in economic blackmail against Australia, and as long as it fails to honor the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement, there is no way that Australia is going to agree to China even being taken seriously as an applicant. I do believe that there is a much stronger case for Taiwan to join the CPTPP. I think that we also may see the United Kingdom join, and that might also help open the door for eventual US participation. But clearly, US engagement in Asia needs to be multidimensional. Trade is a very important part of that. Business investment is an important part of that, which has been successful. But the US has tied its own hands behind its back in refusing or failing to be able to move forward on the TPP and on other bilateral trade agreements, which are long overdue. So thank you for that question. I think it's an excellent one.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. COSSA, and thank you as well to that question, Mr. Pitlo. I have here a question on anonymous question that is on Philippine-China relations, and it's specifically addressed to Dr. Chu Fang. I will read it to the audience. So the question is, oh, sorry, Professor Chu Fang, you were raising your hand. Would you like to respond to the comments first? Yeah. Professor, you're still on mute. Professor Chu Fang, you're still on mute. Yeah, there.
Let me see. I think that Dr. COSSA made the points. So then I think the economic relations in the region is a real testable for the future's trajectory between the great power competition. But the problem is now the economic and the trading relations is a real, I think, the leading variable for how the China-US strategic competition will be heading on. It seemed to me the US now is just how say mired in the we say overwhelmed securitization with our bilateral economic and the trading relations. So then US just trying to pushing on some sort of a decoupling from China, and also want just how say use the security alliance to just work on some sort of we say relocation of the supply change. I consider such a combination between the security and the economic and the commercial relations is a really undermine the regional economic integration, and also will risk some sort of, we say, collapsing the long-sustained East Asia's regional prosperity and development. So then that's also very scared points in my mind. So then, of course, I think in the international, according to the international relations, security always just how say precise over the economies. So then I see the US now is not an exceptional case. US want just how say combine the economic disintegration for its security purpose from China. But the problem is what kind of such a we say adversary consequences it will create it. And in some way, it will be just be harmful to the economic integration. I think such a question also should be easily and equally just asked throughout our ASEAN friends. Then another thing taste is just China's aspiration to be the part of the CPTPP. To be honest, I consider it's a bigger driver for China's trading policy and the domestic open update, because China, of course, by nature is also largely a conservative power. But what kind of a force will pull China out of some sort of China's domestic, regulatory, the hesitance? Then it definitely mean that as the past 4 decades of history powerfully demonstrate that China's full integration into the world community usually serve as a very important driver to get China move little by little. Just in the Chinese advancement of the full integration of China's domestic system into the international regulations or international systems. So that's why I see the CPTPP's participation petition by my country is a bigger driver. So I really hope the US and other regional economies couldn't just underestimate how it will be functioning to get the China more, to get the China opener and also more integrating into the world system. But the current obstacle, as I mentioned, is just the question just mentioned. It's a securitization. So we need just how to get both sides. On the one hand, of course, it's inevitably, it's American security concern to China. But on the other hand, it's economic ingredients really well still just raise the level of economic cooperation and integration to the historical high. How to such two things could be well balanced is a real test for Americans' policy. Of course, to our regional member states, their strategic vision. My view is that if the Australian just overwhelmingly say, wow, the China's trade punch to the Australian, for example, just stopping the red wines, imports into the China, also will constitute some sort of totally overcome just the barrier. I have to say it's a very short-sighted. The Australians should be also just showing Australians policy resilience. Yes, some sort of such a trade, fictions is some sort of irritation to the Australians. But the problem is in the long run, there's no space for Australia, China, and other regional members who could just very greatly just concede from the full economic integrations. By the early of next year, RCEP also will be on the way. I think it's also a very positive signal. The APTPP, CPTPP, if it's enlargement, covering the China, also will bring some sort of a new dynamic. So that's why I think the real test for a region is we needed some strategic insight. We needed to just have an objective look at what China is. China is a positive, growing power. So don't take China as some sort of fully mature as the United States. So China needs some sort of your positive inputs. Then we can working together, teaming together. That's the direction we are destined to head on in future.
Thank you so much, Professor Chu Fang. And again, we have several questions coming in our chat box, but I will read first the anonymous question addressed to me. I think it's on Philippine-China relations. It's specifically addressed to Dr. Chu Fang, so okay. I will read it. I'd like to raise my question to Dr. Chu Fang as anonymous. Dr. COSSA earlier mentioned that Mr. Duterte did not outsmart Xi Jinping. An example of this is the undelivered promise of Beijing to force millions, if not billions, of investment to the Philippines in the context of Duterte's pivot to China. If I may add, Mr. Duterte previously announced that China promised not to build further in disputed shoal, giving an appearance of lessening confrontation, if not aggression. With all these yet to be delivered, if not unfulfilled promises, how can China hold on to its narrative that it is a growing benevolent power who also pursues peace in the region? I believe Beijing puts premium on its image as perceived by world public opinion. So I guess that last part is the main idea of the question. Very interesting question. Would you like to respond, Professor Jufang?
Okay, I think it's a good question. As I mentioned, I think as a neighbor, China, Philippines usually just has a fall into some sort of such a maritime territorial disputes or maritime, we say entitlements centered, disputes. It's also not abnormal. It's a normal because neighbor countries usually always will some sort of their frictions. But the problem is we're still working together, not just bilaterally, also multilaterally. So I think the DOC is a very landmark, document. It also almost like offers some sort of a full set of the behavior norms. I don't think the China is really a violator to the DOC. Actually, the DOC is very illuminating, the real sample for China to follow up. Then we will see, yes, we still have some sort of overcome, territorial disputes. So then, but the province, it also, is seemingly is well managed. That's not just serving as some sort of unovercome, the barrier to just put the China-Philippine relations in danger. So that's why my view is that, yeah, we should have a very objective assessment of what is happening between China and the Philippines over the unresolved Western maritime disputes. I see, yes, it's a very interesting picture. On the one hand, yes, we still have some sort of frictious, the points, but on the other hand, I think some sort of such a friction is also under the control. Does not just become irritation to the both sides, and we will see some sort of such an uncontrollable, dangerous trends, just mostly driven by the such frictions. That I think that kind of assessment is of course is objective. The second is I totally disagree some sort of such assumption. Duterte, whether Duterte is outsmarting the Chinese leader or not. International relations is not just a competition for who is smarter, who is unsmarter, or who is outsmarter, who is undersmarter. So I don't think such a thing is very, very profitable and even we say objective mind sobering, the assessment to relations between Manila and China. But I really love the President Duterte. I do not love him for his China policy. I respect him more for his what? His political dedication to get your country economically better off, socially and politically just cleaner. I think he's an insurmountable fighting against what? The drugger, dealers is highly respected. I think there is quite a few of the international leaders who could just match the President Duterte for his determination to just combat so decisively against such a drug dealing your country. For this point, he's much admirable and respected. So then from my points of view, I consider President Duterte is really some sort of a historical figure, not just get your country in better off position, but also he's a very realistic figure in dealing or still unresolved maritime territorial disputes. But the problem is, in future, how we can just move ahead with the settlement. over South China Sea disputes. I'm really looking forward to next year government could also showcasing some sort of political wisdom and even determinations. Then of course, China also should return in the same way. Then we can move forward. For example, COC discussion on the multilateral, the occasion also should just how say going forward. On the other hand, we will see the bilateral relations. We also should how say pouring more political enthusiasm and the political, the motivation for some sort of settlement of disputes. To be honest, I'm a very positive voice in my country. I really hope China could just how say look up to the Philippines claim and really seeking some sort of just a mutually acceptable, the settlement. So then it's such interactions. It's not just the how say between the two countries, also between the two peoples. So I really hope our Philippine friends, we can also still showing your political enthusiastic in creating our relations at the high level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Chu Feng. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll just arrange them in order. We'll go first with a question from Karen, followed by a question from Jumel, and then some questions from Mr. Lucio again, or from the floor, if there is any. So I would like to read first the question of Karen. It's addressed to everyone in the chat box. How might countries like the Philippines protect its sovereignty and security from the tensions between US and China? Any rule of law, is there any rule of law that protects the Philippines from the differences in interpretation or adherence by US and China? So I guess this is addressed to both speakers. So would you like to start, Professor COSSA? How might countries like the Philippines protect its sovereignty and security? Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, well, I think the simple answer is follow the rules of the road, honor your international agreements. The U.S. is not asking the Philippines or anyone else to choose between the U.S. and China. A positive relationship with both China and with the U.S. is ideal. I don't believe that the U.S. is acting, in any way that would sort of force the Philippines to have to make a choice, and certainly is not doing or asking the Philippines to do anything that would disrespect its sovereignty. All we have asked for, and particularly in the South China Sea, is for a peaceful settlement, for China and ASEAN to deliver on its promise of a code of conduct, both to establish it and then also to follow it, and to keep it in compliance with international law. So I don't expect that if there was a conflict between China and the United States, let's say over Taiwan, I don't believe there will be one, but let's say there is one, I don't think either of us are going to be expecting the Philippines to come to our aid or to get involved in the fight. On the other hand, if there is an attack against an ASEAN country, the Philippines needs to ask itself, how will it respond? What does ASEAN solidarity mean? But that doesn't refer to the U.S. alliance. Our alliance, again, is defensive in defense of the Philippines and not in defense of anyone else.
Thank you, Prof, for that. Yes, Professor Chu Feng, you might want to add something.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So against the backdrop of tightened and intensified the strategic competition between Washington and Beijing, how Philippines could defend your sovereign interests. I think this question, of course, is totally understandable. My answer is, first of all, I think don't just jump into any competition between Washington and Beijing. I see some sort of such a great power competition is inevitable, but most importantly, the third part is the Philippines should just distance themselves from any just security involvement. Then secondly is, I see such a competition also could be modified. If Philippines could play out your middle power activism, for example, so how you just interpret the rule-based order, as I mentioned. So rule-based order should be open, should be inclusive, should it be also just how say judiciary? Yes, but the problem is we need to keep the different parts also well listened. Then the third of my points is we also need just how say some sort of with a mutual respect. For example, so whatever the next government at the Manila will be, I really believe it's not just some sort of reformulation of a Philippines policy over China and the United States. I totally understand the Philippine-US military alliance of long history. So then it could just have a stand intact. But the problem is, Philippines could be used against China for any some sort of such a change the strategic dynamic. I really consider such a Philippines smartness is also could play a very leading role. The last one is, I also hope the Beijing could tap our policy of the South China Sea in a very protective manner. So we need not just to win your hearts by the China's contributing to your economy only. We also should win the Philippines people's friends by what? By earning the China bigger trust from our Philippine people. So that's why the resilience of the China's policy of the South China Sea is totally necessary. So we also will be equally pushed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those contributions. And I would be remiss if I don't ask this follow-up question. And I have one for Professor COSSA. It's about basically Philippine-US alliance. Currently, and I think my colleagues would agree with this, there are discussions to actually rethink the importance or rationale of maintaining the US-Philippine Treaty Alliance, considering that the alliance was conceptualized during the Cold War to combat threats 50 years ago that we can argue are not already existent today. So do you think, Dr. COSSA, given that majority of the cooperation that the US and the Philippines had in the previous decade are centered on transnational issues such as natural disasters, climate change, and development aid, do you think it's high time that we sort of rethink or reform the defense treaty, considering as well that it's not very clear, at least from the Philippines side, that the US will come to the aid of the Philippines to assert security guarantee, if you will, in the West Philippine Sea? Any thoughts on the current state of the alliance, Professor?
Well, I think that alliances are living documents that need to constantly be revitalized and need to adjust to the times. If the Philippines doesn't feel there are any outside threats to the Philippines and no need for any kind of security guarantees or security blankets, there are certainly means of withdrawing from the alliance. And just as the alliance is different now than it was 20, 30 years ago, I was very much involved while still in the US military in the base agreement negotiations and the Philippine decision that it no longer wanted to house US forces in the Philippines. And we respected that because that's what your Senate decided. If there's a change in that and a desire to once again have bases, I think that would be a discussion that both sides would have. I think the terms of the treaty are pretty clear in that an attack on Philippines installations or forces or territory would invoke the treaty. Now, what does invoke the treaty means? It means the two countries would then jointly decide on how to respond. It would require, the U.S. Congress to declare an act of war or to declare that we were in support. But certainly those security assurances are aimed primarily at deterring others from attacking the Philippines in the first place. So if you feel secure that no one would ever attack your facilities or forces or installations, then there are means of leaving the treaty. If you think that the treaty needs to be strengthened and that we need to be doing more training together to make it more credible, then I think that those are also options that need to be discussed. But at the end of the day, I think the U.S. demonstrated very clearly that it will honor Philippine wishes. I remember going to the Philippines shortly after the bases agreement and Philippine friends saying, "Why are you leaving? Why are American forces leaving the Philippines?" And I said, "Because you asked us to, you told us to." And it was sort of like this disbelief that, well, if we'd have thought you were really serious about leaving, we would have never asked you to. But, that's what countries that follow rules-based order do. They develop alliances when both sides agree to it, and they change them when either side says enough. It's at the end of the day, I think the alliance still has some value. And certainly has some deterrent value, but that's up to your government and our government to decide at the end of the day.
Yeah, those are very valid points, Professor. Thank you so much. Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the chat box, and I think the next question, apologies again, Professor COSSA, but I think you'd be able to answer this. It's on the Taiwan Relations Act. And let me read through the whole text by Jumel from the audience. So he writes, the PRC government has already passed an anti-secession law that says, quote, if possibilities for a peaceful reunification should be completely exhausted, the state shall employ non-peaceful means, end quote. PRC leaders believe the present government in Taiwan, led by Tsai Ing-wen, is unwilling to negotiate in good faith based on past PRC-ROC agreements. PRC leaders could interpret Tsai's unwillingness to accept those past agreements and her assertion that Taiwan is already an independent country as fulfilling that legal prerequisite condition. Now, the question is, should PRC leaders decide to act upon that interpretation, do you think US leaders will be compelled under the terms of a US domestic law called the Taiwan Relations Act to use non-peaceful means to try to stop China? Why? So, Professor?
The Taiwan Relations Act requires the United States to help Taiwan defend itself. That can take many different forms. It can take the form of economic assistance. It can take the form of military sales, which it has. It can take the form of training of Taiwan military officers, which is, again, another facet of the relationship. If China is, in my view, foolish enough to attack Taiwan, I think it has to assume that the United States will respond. How will the United States respond? That will be very situation dependent. At an absolute minimum, there will be severe economic sanctions. At an absolute minimum, there will be political consequences. And it would not surprise me if there were also military measures to be taken. I think if China were to be foolish enough to try to blockade Taiwan, American aircraft carriers would sail through that blockade, and then the decision would be up to China whether to go to war against the United States, understanding that a blockade is in fact an act of war. So, the president will decide and the Congress will declare at the time. But I think it's very clear if you read US press, even as Yu Feng has noted, one of the few things that Republicans and Democrats in the United States agree on today is that Taiwan's democracy should be protected. 80% of the people in Taiwan believe that if China were to attack, that they would fight to prevent China from conquering Taiwan. And a majority of people in the United States believe that the US should come to Taiwan's aid if Taiwan is attacked. So I think Chinese military planners will have no way of knowing for sure what the United States will do. That's part of the US strategic ambiguity concept. But if they're smart, they better factor in the high probability that there will be a US response politically, diplomatically, economically, and in all likelihood, militarily as well. I don't think that that attack is going to occur for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because I don't believe China is capable today of conquering the island. They are capable of creating a lot of pain and punishment. At the end of the day, it would guarantee that reunification will never occur. It is not capable of getting across 90 miles of the strait, landing in a contested landing, and then neutralizing 24 million people who have fought for democracy and who plan to continue to fight for democracy. So I certainly can't decide, it's not my decision whether or not the United States would respond militarily, but I would certainly vote yes if somebody asked me. And I would think the majority in the US Congress would not only approve of that, they would insist upon it. And as we see Australia and as we see Europe, European Parliament has a delegation visiting or just recently visited Taiwan to announce its support and defense for Taiwan democracy and greater international space. I think the world would be very sympathetic, in part because under the DPP leadership, they have not done anything to provoke China. In fact, they tried very hard to come up with their own one country, two systems formula, if you will. They wouldn't agree to the 92 consensus since that was the KMT's motto, but they did talk about one constitutional China, which is the same basis as the 92 consensus. So China had an opportunity to cooperate with Tsai Ing-wen and the Taiwan government, and it chose to be a bully instead. I think that what it's seeing now is a global reaction demonstrating sympathy for Taiwan. So beyond that, I can't predict exactly what would happen, but I'd pretty well bet on it. Were the US to fail to help defend Taiwan, then I think it would create doubt among our other allies like Japan or South Korea as to whether or not we would come to their aid if they were attacked. And at the end of the day, if South Korea, Japan, or Taiwan were convinced that the United States would not defend them, then they have two options. They can either surrender to China or they can develop their own nuclear weapons capability. Which one do you think they'd choose?
Yes, Professor Zhu Fang, would you like to add? Yeah. Professor, I think you're still on mute. Yeah.
Thank you. So I totally understand what Dr. COSSA talked about Taiwan issue. It's really a very potentially dangerous, the fresh point in the East Asia. So I'm also just equally worried how the things will be totally overwhelming the regional security order if the China and the US just couldn't just behave ourselves. Yes, I have to say the Taiwan issue is really some sort of a real testing point. But the problem is, from the Chinese perspective, I consider one of the leading concern from the Beijing is the U.S. Using the, for example, defending the Taiwanese people for the human rights and the liberty. Also, well, unstoppably just fuel the Taiwan's secessionalism. So that kind of things is really forced China into the corner. Then we will see the past years, some sort of interactions between the Taiwan and Washington is really favorable to the Taiwan's, secessionalist approach. This really concerns China very much. On the other hand, we consider the nature of the Taiwan issue is unfinished the national reunification, just largely due to the civil war before in 1949. So then the nature of the Taiwan issue is not just how say Taiwanese people's liberty and human rights, but we consider some sort of such a mistanglement. It's really now just a few of Taiwan's secessionalist trends. So how China could respond? First of all, I don't see there's any decisive change to the China's traditional formula, peaceful reunification, unless Taiwan legally declare it will be just a independent Republic of Taiwan. But the second, we also have to show in the China's opposition to such an emerging Taiwan's secessionalist, the adventurism. So then, yes, military intimidation is not just the China's some sort of we say bullying. It's the China's political reaction to stop the Taiwan from moving ahead with its independence. We should understand its a real nature of the China's high profile, the military diplomatic, the intimidations. Then last one is there any way the US and China could come to any recession of the Taiwan once again? I think it's a real test. The Beijing's formula is that some sort of shared consensus between Beijing and Washington is not the Taiwan Relations Act, is also a couple of joint communiques declared by both governments. So US should adhere to its a one China policy, rather than just very disastrously turn to some sort of a new formula of one China, one Taiwan. So my view is that US also should understand where the China's limit is. So Taiwan's independence movement is really unovercome nationalistic irritation to Chinese people. If the China just keep the hand off, then the Chinese government will be under the danger in face of the China's such a nationalistic sentiments. So Beijing have to respond in some sort of forcible way. But on the other hand, the US should also understand the Taiwan issue is not just fretting around over our relations right now in the past 4 decades. Where also both sides always got involved into some sort of a disarray of the Taiwan policy claiming and acting on. So then I really love to see some sort of a political caution between the both sides. Don't overplay. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Chu Feng. For everyone, unfortunately, we ran out of time, so I guess that would be our last question for today. If you have questions, you can certainly reach out at your own capacity to our speakers for today. But before we formally end, may we ask our guests and speakers for today to have one last final remark on perhaps possible ways of moving forward for cooperation between US and China. So yeah, just one final remark or last words on that particular issue on the prospects for cooperation. Professor Cosa, would you like to begin?
Well, I think that leadership is required. It requires both of our leaders, President Biden and President Xi, to set the right tone at the summit meeting next week and to put out the parameters to understand that there will be managed competition, but that there will also be a cooperation where our interests overlap. Neither side wants to have a war with the other. Taiwan is a flashpoint. I think I would hope that China understands that a little more benevolent policy toward Taiwan might be in its interest. I have for decades now put forth my own solution to the China-Taiwan problem, and that's to announce that there is only one China, and that Taiwan and the PRC are both part of that China. In other words, to create a greater China that would result in shared sovereignty between China and Taiwan over the territories that each currently control. This would be, in effect, accepting reality, something that leaders in all three countries, including Taiwan, have not been prepared to do. But to me, that would be the real solution, would be to accept the actual status quo rather than the pretend status quo that the one China principle stands for today. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, Professor Chufang, last words.
Yeah, I love the COSSA solution to the cross-Taiwan trade relations. Yeah, I think such a, even literally, and I think the sovereign combination is really, really necessary, but a promising one way. So I hope the US could play a very productive role. On the other hand, I really enjoyed today's discussion. Dr. Koza is a very senior and a thoughtful expert on Asia Pacific affairs. In the past more than 3 decades, I learned a lot from Dr. Koza's publication and his leadership in Pacific Forum. So I salute you, Dr. Koza. But on the other hand, I really hope that our American friend and the Philippine friends could cast a new look at China. China changed, but I don't think that such a change is definitely waste China's some sort of basic national security strategy. China changed with a lot of some sort of new characters. I mean, we have a strong man like China's politics. We also have more confidence China's leadership. We also have more, some sort of China domestic-centric, some sort of such a political aspiration to get the people better off. On the other hand, I also see that China's frustration is also growing up. We consider we did a lot of a good job, get the people better off. But why US always punch the China, always slash the China? So then I see a lot of such a, we say, competition between the Beijing and the Washington, just has a quite likely just stemmed from what? From some sort of a different interpretation, different mood setting, and a different some sort of explanation of how such a deterioration goes. So that's why I really put a lot of hope on the next Monday's virtual online summit meet. I don't think President Biden will have any just a privilege to reset the relationship with the Beijing, but at least we need to achieve some sort of very important and achievable, the compromise and rebuild some sort of the confidence and even predictability of our policy outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's it for our webinar lecture for today. And again, I thank our speakers for today, Dr. Ralph COSSA and Dr. Chu Fang. Very constructive and level-headed discussion on arguably the most important major power relationship in this century. And I trust that all of our audience for today learned a lot from the discussion, and the perks of having a virtual seminar like this. You can sort of recap the entire lecture on our Facebook page. Again, that's the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies. Please do like us as well in our social media pages. Again, I would like to, on behalf of PAX, no, I would like to extend our deepest gratitude for our speakers for today, as well as to our audience who have taken the time of their weekend morning listening to our lecture for today. So that's it, and I look forward to meeting everyone again. Do catch us on more webinar lectures we have lined up for everybody. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a
Thank
nice
you.
lunch.
Thank you.
Dr.
Thank
Fang.
you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
have a good
Aloha.
day. Have a good night, Dr. Koza. Yeah,
Thank you.
Aloha. You fun.
aloha.
Take care.
Yeah, thank you.